first time my daughter actually really jumped in and did a lot of cooking and stuff.
You got to pay the right
she can clean up afterwards too.
I watched these.
As everyone, or most everyone knows, the act of friction, or like when you rub your hands together, things get warm. When two pieces of wood rub together, it creates heat and dust also from both pieces. So when you do that in an artful way, in the process of bow drill, using a string and a bow to spin a round cylindrical spindle in what we call fireboard, that process creates the heat and dust necessary for lighting a small coal that can then be transferred to a tinder bundle, which is then blown into a flame. The components of a bow drill kit are a fireboard, which is what we place on the ground, a spindle, which spins in the fireboard, a handhold, which is allowing us we put a handhold on top of the spindle to allow downward pressure and to allow us keep the spindle stable. And then a bow drill bow, which is not like a bow in the traditional sense of an archery bow, but like a piece of wood that has maybe a little bit of curve to it, and that has a string or a piece of cordage or natural material that could be used as cordage stretched across it, so that when we put the spindle into the bow string, we twist the spindle into the string, and as the string runs along the edge of the spindle, it spins the spindle in either direction depending on which direction you're pulling the bow.
We could maybe use this as a spindle, see like the fingernail?
Material selection is very landscape dependent. You can be collecting different materials depending on what region of the country you're in. Here in Western Washington, the middle of kind of the fall right now, very wet, very, very challenging to collect bow drill materials off the landscape for use that in the immediate time following your collection, because everything is so wet, there's so much moisture in the air, everything is pretty much saturated. So I always advocate when you're collecting fire materials in the Northwest to collect out of the trees, off the ground. Trees provide a certain amount of protection from the elements, as well as things that are collected off the ground are able to get air circulation, and they're able to dry out much faster than materials that are on the ground, which really won't dry out at all until next summer. So collecting materials out of the trees is important. Also, just having an awareness of the sun, which is our main source of drying, in addition to the wind. The sun is our main force drying out these materials. Having an awareness of where the sun is, which direction the trees are facing. The south-facing sides of trees are going to get a lot more sun. Trees on south-facing slopes, since the sun is in the south in the middle of the day and throughout the day, since we're in the northern hemisphere, get a lot more sun. And also trees that are on the edges of clearings get a lot more sun as well.
It would be good for spindle though, but it's just really wet.
So when you're carving a bow drill kit, one thing is important is to have a spindle that's actually round, because if you have a spindle that has a large jutting out bump on one side or something, it's going to, when that bump runs around in a circle, of course it's going to create a bigger hole than the actual spindle diameter, and that's going to create a looseness there. Everything with your bow drill kit, you want it to have a tightness. Everything needs to be form-fitting and fit just right. So you want a round spindle. Generally, at the top of the spindle, I like to carve a longer tapered point. Reason being is that the top of the spindle is receiving friction, of course, and the bottom of the spindle is receiving friction, but we don't really want there to be friction at the top. Once we burn in and make a good joint, male-female kind of seat joint between our handhold and our spindle, we no longer want there to be friction up there. That friction is robbing us of energy, of speed, and so it's just not efficient to have friction there. So we want that, if by carving a longer point at the top, we're reducing the amount of surface area that is meeting at the handhold spindle junction, and that reduced surface area reduces the friction. We also will then lubricate that joint once we are sure that we have a good seat there, a good stable base for our handhold to hold our spindle in. And at the bottom of the spindle, we'll carve a much duller point, and that point will allow us to get started. So as we take our fireboard, we'll make like a little hole in the fireboard, a little dent in the fireboard, and that duller point will then go into that little hole that we've made with our knife, and we'll start to create a a spot for the spindle to begin to burn. So as the spindle begins to burn, it will naturally create an indention in the fireboard that's the same as the spindle because it's burning in. Once our spindle has burned into our fireboard sufficiently, which generally is when it's burned all the way to the full diameter of the spindle, it's burned down to the full diameter, then we'll cut a notch in the fireboard. That's the point when we would lubricate our handhold if we hadn't already done that. And then the notch in the fireboard really provides a spot for the dust to go. So if you don't create a notch in the fireboard, the hot part of the spindle is not contacting the dust since the dust is building up around the outside. The dust has got to go somewhere, and so it's being pushed up the outsides and it's gathering around the outside of the spindle, not contacting the hot part of the spindle. So by carving a notch, we allow the dust a spot to fall into, and then the spindle is then, the end of the spindle is then in direct contact with the dust as the dust builds up in the notch. So once that happens, we increase our pressure and our speed, sometimes just increase speed, not pressure, depending on what type of material we're using, and heat that spindle up as hot as we can get it. Kind of a magical temperature that's often thrown around is 800 degrees. Not really that important. But that's the temperature at which the dust will then kind of ignite. And it won't ignite in the form that most people think of as a fire. It will create a small ember that's very delicate, and then we'll put that into a fluffed up like bark bundle, something that might resemble a small bird's nest, something really fluffy and fine-grained. Inner bark works really well. We'll put that in there, and then that little coal will begin to start to burn that bark, and that bark in turn, when given oxygen through our breath, will blow up into a flame. And then we'll add our sticks onto that to build our fire. In my own view, the reason I practice these skills is I really, for one, appreciate the connection that it gives me to the landscape. I mean, you might think of bow drill only as fire, but in order to be good with bow drill, you have to know the properties of trees. You have to know how the sun moves across the sky, like I said. You have to know your own body, your own strength, and your own limitations. You get out through finding materials and gathering materials on amazing adventures and connection to the natural world. And then on top of all of that, after you've learned all of this incredible knowledge, just pursuing this one skill, you gain a self-sufficiency from it, an ability to take care of yourself in the outdoors that really lends an amazing freedom to life.